Hi everyone, this is Cindy Shebley from the Web Seller Circle. Today we're going to talk about interviewing. This is part 3 in the presenter series exclusively for members of the Web Seller Circle. We have 5 more segments to go. I hope you're finding this information useful. And as a quick reminder to you all, if you have questions after the tutorial is over, please head on over to the forum at the Web Seller Circle and ask your questions. Would love to see a dialogue going on this presenter series and what you think about it or any further questions. In this part, I'm going to talk about interviewing. I'm going to talk a little bit about being on both sides of the table. First, I'm going to talk about being the person giving the interview or the host, and then we're going to discuss the other side, being the guest. Now, how you handle yourself in both situations will reflect on your authority as a presenter. So let's go ahead and jump in. Tonight, we're going to talk about how to find and ask guests to appear on your program, how to present them and make them comfortable while they are on the show, tips on how to interview them, and finally, we're going to talk about what to do when the table is turned and you're in the hot seat, being the one who is interviewed. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to start with finding and asking guests. A lot of the experience that I'm drawing on tonight is from my experience with working with Janelle Elms at OSI Rockstars. A few years ago, she started her OSI Rockstars, and she interviewed me a few times for the show and decided that I might be somebody that she wanted to interview myself. So one day while I was out walking my dogs, I got a telephone call from Janelle asking me or inviting me to do a series of interviews. I was really excited and I said yes right away. And we decided that I would start doing a series called Success with Cindy, and it was about how to be a more effective educational specialist. But if you know Janelle, she's a real kind of type A personality, and once she gets an idea, she starts running with it. In an instant, I was an interviewer. What a learning curve it was. Anyhow, we started the next week, literally, to give myself some slack. I asked Janelle if she would be the first person that I would interview. She agreed, and as an interviewer, I actually wouldn't say it was one of my more shining moments, but Janelle is truly a professional, and she made us both sound really good. But when I had a lunch with some of the other local eBay Success group later that week after the interview, one of them pulled me aside, and her critique of that interview with Janelle was, "Cindy, you're no Janelle." It kind of bummed me out, but it also made me realize I had a lot to learn, and I dug in and started working on it. The reason why I'm bringing this up is to make the point that everybody starts at the bottom and they learn. So don't be afraid to ask people that have been doing this for a while when you start looking for guests. And if you decide to do a regular podcast, I can assure you, you're soon going to find out that feeding the monster is kind of a continual battle. You're going to run through your address book very quickly, and finding new guests is something you're always going to be on the lookout for. So if you're thinking about doing a podcast or a regular series, start right now asking yourself who it is that you respect and who you'd like to interview if you had a chance. Write those names down and aim high. Remember, everybody starts at the bottom. You don't know unless you ask, so aim high. And once you have that list of people, well, guess what? It's time to jump in and ask them. Now, how do you get somebody outside of your circle to agree to become a guest on your program? It kind of goes back to that old acronym, WIIFM. If you don't know what that stands for, it's what's in it for me. And what you need to do is consider what your broadcast will offer to your potential guests. Now, I've been really busy this year, and you may have noticed that I haven't been quite as accessible as I used to be. That's because I had to make the conscious decision that between the tight economy and my need for sleep once in a while, I had to trim some of my projects. I'm no different than most people when you come to asking. We're pretty darn busy. But earlier this week, a woman named Krista from Octiva sent me an email. And this is, I've turned down a fair number of people on some really cool projects. But her email invitation was to become a regular writer for no compensation on the Octiva newsletter. You know what? Without hesitation, I said yes. I sent an email right back. That's because her pitch to me told me exactly what was in it for me. Here's a piece of the email in case you're wondering how it works. Here's what she wrote. The online seller e-newsletter goes out to more than 330,000 opt-in subscribers worldwide. All articles published in the EDU site are accompanied by a bio in which authors may include links to their websites and or recent works. Many of our contributors report significant increases in traffic to their sites as a result of writing for Octiva. That pretty much nailed it for me. I sent her back a yes right away. So let's take a couple of minutes and brainstorm about ideas on how you can ask your potential guest or what you can tell your potential guest is in it for them. So I'm going to open up the chat and see if you have any ideas of what's in it for them for asking guests. Reach a new audience, absolutely. A way to promote your book, yes, telling somebody who has a book. Yes, telling them absolutely. This is a way to promote your book because authors are always looking for ways to promote their books. Even though they have publishers, it's sort of up to them. So those are a couple of really good ideas. Build your authority, yes. Tell your potential guest that it would help. Social marketing of a product, absolutely. The word social marketing is really important these days. Okay, so those are some really good ideas. Here's some of the things I came up with if you don't have the opportunity to offer somebody 300,000 potential subscribers to see your work. You're going to have to think a little bit creatively. The other thing is that you probably don't want to ask that person cold turkey. If you don't know them, just sending an email out of the blue is probably not going to work either. So the first thing you want to do is work on how to butter them up a bit. If they have a blog or a Facebook account, be sure to comment regularly on their writing. Us writers, we don't just write for thin air. We love it when people respond and comment on our blogs. Of course, if you're a tweeter, retweet their tweets. I notice that you all do that for me fairly frequently. It always surprises and amazes me. That simple act captures my attention every time. And even though I know I should and I don't always respond in kind, I do keep it in mind and I do appreciate it. So if somebody who regularly retweets my posts, retweets and asks me to be on their program, I'm much more likely to say yes. You also want to think about how you can do them a favor before you ask them to be a guest. Everyone who writes a blog wants to take a break now and again. If you offer to write an article, it will definitely go over well, especially if the article makes the author look good, having you as a guest poster. So having that as a favor, they're much more likely to say yes to being a guest on your podcast. Okay, so you got them to say yes. Let's stop here for a second and see if you guys have any tips we can think of to prepare for guests before I give you my 2 cents worth. Yes, read their book, blog, and newsletter, absolutely. Check out their website, yes. Make notes, absolutely. Start preparing them and yourself as you are about to interview them. Ask them, what do you want me to ask you? Yes, very good point, Beth. Absolutely, you nailed it. That's a really important one. Okay, so that's a couple of really good points. Here's what I came up with. Ask your guests for a list of questions that they'd like to be asked. I love this as a host because it means less work for me. I don't have to think up the questions that we might want to ask our guests. And you'd be surprised, but most guests would prefer that as well. They know that if they provide you with a list of questions, they're more likely that you're going to stay on topic and talk about what they want to talk about during the podcast. Now, I've occasionally been on eBay Radio, and eBay Radio, when they invite you onto the show, will ask you for a list of questions. As an interviewee or the guest, you send Griff the questions you want him to ask, and he'll just ask the questions and move you along through the interview. So it's a very standard way for interviews to happen. On the other end, if your guest doesn't want to provide you with a list of questions, you can prepare the questions on your own a few days before and send them to your guest. Now, if you can't think of questions, a very standard thing to do is to put an opt-in form in a sign-up box for the podcast or the interview. And you'll ask your participants who are going to be on the call, what questions would you like your guest to be asked, or your host to ask your guest. Now, you as the host will want to weed through those questions a few days beforehand and send the questions that most represent the questions from the audience. It's a very simple way to do it. But do send those questions ahead so your guest has some time to consider and contemplate the answer. Meanwhile, on your end, you should get to know your guests. So read their material. If they have a book, read that. If they've done other interviews, listen. Find out as much as you can on them or their subject. Having a working knowledge of the material is not only going to be respectful to your guest, but the better prepared you are, the more polished that interview is going to be when you finally get to it. If your guest is not familiar with the hardware or how the interview works, be sure to offer them a chance to practice before the main event. Yeah, it takes a little extra time, but even if they say no, it goes a long way towards making your guest feel more comfortable about the interview. Also, if there's any special requirements for that guest, you need to let them know ahead of time. Very often these podcasts through the internet will ask you to call in via a landline or a regular phone to get the best audio. Well, we are so used to cell phones and VoIP, we may not think about it. And if you have a cell phone, you're thinking maybe I'll call in on my cell phone for the interview where I can go and get into a quiet place. Your guest isn't going to necessarily consider using that old landline, and it can cause a few distractions. So if you need them to use like a landline, you need to tell them ahead of time, because they'll have to get rid of the pets and the noisy coworkers and the kids and all that stuff and all the distractions, because usually landline phones are right in the middle of all the action. So let your guests know ahead of time any special requirements like that. And, you know, this podcast may be a regular deal to you, or it may be even a very big deal for you if you get a big name interview. But remember, you're not the center of everybody's universe. And it's good to remind or send reminders to your guests. It takes a few minutes, and you may even feel like you're pestering your guest, but I can assure you that they like to know that you're really excited about them showing up on your program, so they're not going to mind a couple of extra emails. A couple of times when I've been interviewed, I've actually been caught off guard because I've forgotten that I said yes to a podcast interview and end up at the very last minute scrambling to make things happen. And worse yet, I have been a listener on several programs or podcast interviews where the guests simply forgot that they were supposed to show up, or they got the date or time confused. So send reminders out. I know it's extra work. It's going to get your guests there on time. We've got the guests there. We've got them reminded. It's the big day. In this section, I'm going to talk about how you get through that interview. The first thing you want to remember is the golden rule. And the golden rule in this instance is you are not the star. Yes, it is your series and your podcast, but you've asked the guest on as a special star. So they are the ones that should be doing the talking. They should be the ones giving their opinions, and they should be the one charming your listeners. Your job as the host is to listen, make agreeing comments, and segueing your guest into the next question. Now, I know that sounds pretty simple. You just have to remove your ego and let go, but not so fast. Got a question for you. Which one of these do you think is worse? Is it worse to have a talker who can't stop or someone with just one-word answers? We got one person who votes for one-word answers. Well, this is actually one of those kind of questions that, if a tree falls in a forest, there really isn't a right or wrong answer. The bottom line, though, is that you really do need to be prepared for both. Personally, when I'm interviewing somebody, I prefer a chatty person because it's easier to cut somebody off sometimes. I've had some people I couldn't quite cut off, but it's easier to cut them off than it is to try to figure out how to fill in airspace when somebody only answers you with a yes or no answer. Knowing their material is going to be very valuable to you. If you get somebody who's really nervous and they're only giving you those yes or no answers, if you know the material, let's say a book, and you've read it, you know kind of what they're passionate about, you can draw them out possibly by asking them longer questions about the part of the book or whatever it is that they're involved in that they're really passionate about. And if you can get them talking about their passions, you're probably going to make it through the interview. Also, the type of interviews that I'm talking about tonight, the podcasts, they're really not hard-hitting, gotcha-type reporting. Let's leave that for 60 Minutes or Nightline or whatever. As your preparation for the interview, you may want to ask your guest if there's anything that they would really prefer to keep off topic and leave it off your list of questions. Likewise, if during the interview you have a guest who seems to be hedging or avoiding answering the question, don't keep picking at the answer until they finally answer it for you, because you may win that question and get that answered, but once you picked at a guest like that, they're going to close down and shut you out, and you're going to spend the rest of the interview with those 1- and 2-word answers. So you don't need to just keep hard-hitting reporting for the kind of interviews that we're talking about. And also, I know that there are a lot of podcasts that are social in nature, and I just want to say that if that's your kind of podcast, that's great, but that's a different podcast than having a guest. I know like TalkShoe has a chat feature, and the chat gets going. Your guest is reading that chat as well as trying to pay attention to what you're asking them. And if the chat starts getting off topic, remind your chatters that this is what the program is about and to stay on topic. It's disrespectful to be talking about the weather or whatever you feel like when somebody has agreed to come on your show, has spent the time preparing to be on your show, and they see you talking about something totally unrelated to what they are presenting. So if you have that kind of podcast, you may want to say, hold those kind of chats until after our guest is done, and then we'll have our social 15 minutes or half hour, whatever it needs to be, after they're done. But do respect your guest's time and remind your chatters to stay on topic while they are speaking. That's enough of the Emily Post stuff. I promised you that I would also talk about getting prepared as a guest if you're ever asked about doing an interview. So let's move on to that. We talked about the many ways that you can prepare a guest, and of course these are all ideals. As somebody who's been asked to be interviewed as a guest, I seldom get the questions beforehand, and if I do, they end up coming like 2 or 3 minutes before the call. And a couple of times I've actually felt ambushed or overpowered by my interviewer. These things happen, but if you spend a little preparation knowing that you're going into the interview as a guest, these things will be easier to cope with as you go along. So if you're asked to be a guest on a podcast, the first thing you need to do is spend a little time considering what your 3 key messages are and make it your goal throughout the podcast or the interview to expand and repeat those 3 key messages at least 3 times. Believe it or not, this really works well because people don't absorb things the first time. So 3 seems to be the magic number, repeating it 3 times. So it really does help people to absorb the information. Once you have your 3 key messages, now you need to start thinking about how you're going to get those key messages out. If you want your name, your book, your company, or whatever it is to get spread, think sound bites. In our case, what we want are like short summations of what we're saying, and hopefully that they're repeatable. Think Twitter, 140 characters or less that can be tweeted and spread throughout social media. Now, if you have something that you believe in as a guest, or when you're talking as a guest, if you are you really believe in it, you're really passionate about it, it's very easy to be enthusiastic. People are going to hear the excitement in your voice, and they're going to tune right into what you have to say. However, it's not always going to be that way. You're not going to feel enthusiastic, and there are lots of days that you're not going to feel at the top of your game. So how do you keep your listeners engaged and listening to you? Well, you do that with inflection. Now, inflection literally means to bend or alter. Vocal inflection means specifically to use voice variables. Pace. Words spoken at a steady, even pace sound like the hum of a clothes dryer, and after a while lull your listeners into inattention. Vary the delivery speed. Start slow, pick up the pace. The average brain can communicate or intake speech at about 800 words per minute. That's a lot faster than we can talk. Our normal speech, about 100 words per minute. Our microprocessors, or our brains, really can absorb if we speak faster. It's surprising, but people really do absorb faster if you speak a little bit faster. It gets those things firing in our brains. Pauses or silence. Now, I'm sure everybody's heard on the radio, you never want to have silence. Silence is deadly. We try to avoid them whenever possible, but really pauses can work for you. They can be very effective. They can communicate things like, I'm relaxed, I'm confident, and I'm thoughtful. They can also signal transitions from one topic to the next. And if you really want to grab somebody's attention, try a silent pause. When I first started teaching eBay, I was invited to a local eBay group here in town. It was a dinner meeting. And I was asked to talk about eBay. And I got up, everybody had their pizza, had their beer, was sitting down, and I had a PowerPoint presentation, and I was giving my presentation, and everybody was just having a rip-roaring time, laughing and talking, and they weren't really paying attention to me. In fact, the president of the club or the group got up a couple of times and asked people to be quiet, to listen to what Cindy was saying. And it would work for a minute, but before you knew it, they'd be back off to giggling and talking. And I was starting to get a little bit frustrated that people weren't listening to me. It was bugging me and my ego. So at one point, I simply stopped talking for about 15 seconds, midway through the sentence. At about 5 seconds, the whole room went silent. And within a few seconds, everybody's eyes were riveted on me. I let the silence linger a little bit longer while I was gathering my thoughts, and then I went back to starting my talk again. And for the rest of the evening, people were very quiet, respectful, and paid attention to what I was saying up at the front of the room. So silences are really, really effective in a lot of situations where you need to gain control again. Pitch. Add highs and lows into your speech, especially if you're reading from a script. There is an unmistakable monotone when you're reading. So if you are going to read, understand that most people recognize that you're reading. So practice your reading before you get online. Practice those answers. Practice what you're going to say, even if you're going to read it. You need to practice reading it. Volume. Well, now you probably don't want to yell into a microphone, but you can raise and lower your voice, and it can help gather people's attention. Just like silence, whispering can really capture somebody's attention as well. It makes them stop, move forward, and get closer to their computer to hear what you're saying. They're more attentive. So raising and lowering your voices will also help with making it more interesting and a better learning point for your audience. Now, you're going to need to be prepared for some tough questions as well. Maybe not in a podcast among friends, but if you really get into an interview with any larger media, remember that controversy sells, and many professional reporters will use it on you. So what happens if you're asked a tough question? Before you get to the interview, as much time beforehand as possible, pull out a worksheet and write down things like the difficult questions you've had before from past interviews, questions you'd prefer to be not to answer, but might be fair game to that reporter. Issues of controversy that are difficult in your field. You may not think you're there as a representative of a company if you're a private contractor, but I can assure you your audience doesn't make that same distinction as you do. Anybody who's been an eBay education specialist knows what I'm talking about when those PayPal questions and the feedback questions start. So write them down on your worksheet. Then take a couple of days and mull over your answers. Once you have the answers you think will work, write them down next to your tough question, and then start practicing reading those answers. Practice them so well that they come out of your mouth naturally, and then when you get to the point where that reporter asks you those tough questions, it'll come out of your mouth really simply. Now, as a guest, you really are in the driver's seat. Don't let a host bowl you over. You are allowed to say things like, I will only talk about whatever it is you're only going to talk about. You'll only answer so many questions. I'm going to only answer 5 questions. Or I'm only going to be on the show for X minutes. I'm not going to be there for 8 hours like you want me to. You are allowed to do that. You are the guest of honor. Now, if you think there's going to be a lot of tough questions especially, one technique that some interviewees have used is to always pause before they answer. Now think about it. You start training your audience to expect you to pause, and if you get thrown a curveball, That pause will be very natural, and people won't really suspect that you're pausing to think of your answer before you answer it. So again, that's one thing that you can do if you think it's going to be a tough interview. Now, there's such a thing also is called a bridge answer. And that may be something where your host is getting you off topic and you want to get back on topic. And I'm not so good at explaining it, so I thought that I would read an example of a bridge answer and what it means from a book I have. And the book is called Get to the Point by Andrew Gilman and Karen Bergs. Okay, here we go. As the name suggests, the technique consists of building a verbal bridge between the point raised by the questioner and the selling point you wish to emphasize. Case Study 1. A classic example of skillful bridging is drawn from the 1980 presidential campaign where candidate Edward Kennedy appeared on a television interview program. The senator's pet campaign issue was health care program for the elderly, and it was a very popular issue. His selling points were bankable votes for him, so he naturally wanted to make the audience aware of it. 20 minutes of the 30-minute program had gone by, and the senator hadn't had an opportunity to talk about health care. The next question was, "Senator, what is your view on the MX missile?" Think about it for a minute. What would you do in this situation? You need to answer the question, but you also need to get in some of your selling points. Is there any way you can answer the question and find a connection that will allow you to bridge to health care? How about the issues of cost? Senator Kennedy's answer went something like this. "My staff and I are against the MX. We don't think it's the right weapon systems for the country. First of all, we are adequately covered by our existing systems. Second, you can't look at the MX or any other weapon system without focusing on its cost. We only have so much money in our national budget. I believe that more funds should be spent on domestic priorities, such as rebuilding our roads or in areas such as national health care." With this bridge, Kennedy was off and running. In this country today, the average American senior citizen spends about 1/3 of his or her income for health care maintenance. With my bill, we could bring this down by 1/5 or less, and each elderly person in this town could save as much as $400 a year. At this point, the reporters might follow up with further questions on the health care issue, or they might come back to the MX missile. The point is that the smooth transition gave the senator a chance to make his selling point and left him in a position where it was even odds he would be able to make others. That's the technique in a nutshell. Here, with a smooth, logical, persuasive path from the issue of a weapon system to the broader issue of cost and national budget to a specific economic issue, the high cost of health care, and finally the selling point, the Kennedy-sponsored bill and its benefits for the elderly. So that's a bridge answer, and I think it's a really interesting technique that we should all keep in our toolbox. And that was from Get to the Point by Andrew Gilman and Karen Berg. Moving on, don't be negative. In other words, if you are asked a negative question, don't repeat back the negative question. If you repeat it back verbatim, the whole negative takes on a life of its own and emphasizes the negative. While you do want to validate the question, what the questioner asks, it's important not to repeat back the words they used. Move the interview along. You don't want to answer in one syllable or two-syllable answers, but you do want to keep your answers fairly quick, 30 seconds to a minute. Don't try to get too many paragraphs in there to answer it. Try to cut it down because people's attention is fairly short. And there are a couple of other traps that we tend to naturally fall into when we're guests on programs. If we're praised, we're taught to be modest. It's part of our culture. But if during an interview you get somebody who praises you, it is really natural for us to just kind of brush it off with a blunt answer or even, be self-effacing about it. But you shouldn't do that. It drops your authority, and you want to keep your authority up as an interviewer. So try to avoid that. If somebody praises you, do thank them honestly and sincerely and warmly for those very kind words and move on. All right, you know them. Nitpickers are those people who pick at the tiny details that live out there in the gray zone. That nitpicker is going to quibble with you over facts and figures that have relatively little to do with what you're saying. Or they may simply even have their facts wrong. Don't spend too much energy on them or time, and don't waste your audience's time as well. If you believe what you're saying is true and the nitpicker's not letting it go, you can try saying something like this: I honestly believe my facts are correct. However, instead of taking up any more of the audience's time, let's move on. How about you contact me after the show at cindy@clovercity.com, and we can compare notes about this, and then move on, have your host move on to the next question. Try not to answer hypothetical questions with hypothetical answers, but you may be put into a corner at some point. If you are, always flag that it is a hypothetical answer to a hypothetical question. Get it in as often as you can that this is hypothetical, it is not true or in fact. And finally, don't be afraid to say no. Now, I know when you get into the guest seat, you naturally want to think you know everything and that you're going to be the expert, but it's truly impossible to know everything that's going to be asked. And don't try to BS your way through the answer. You're going to get much more respect from your audience if you just say once in a while that you really don't know. You could follow it up by saying, I can look that up and see if we can find out. Why don't you give me, send me an email at griff@ebay.com or whatever, and move the show along. But it's not wrong to say I don't know. Okay, so I went through most of the worst case scenarios with you to get you prepared, but the truth is that they're not probably going to happen on your podcast or interview. But it's always good to be prepared for the worst, because the more practice and more preparation you have ahead of time, the more confident you're going to come off and the more enjoyable your time in front of the mic is going to be. And the audience may learn a thing or two as well. So with that, I'm going to open up the chat to questions and see if you have any questions before we go. Did I practice before your first podcast interviews? Well, I did practice a bit. Whenever I was interviewed and I got the questions, I would try to figure out what the answers would be. And I do practice a lot before every one of them that I can. So if I have any way at all to practice before I do it, I would, yes. Now, when I first started the Success with Cindy series, I didn't have a chance to practice. We just went from one week to the next, and I was just sort of jump in with all 4 feet. But I do try to practice as much as possible, and when I do give a presentation like this, I do spend time walking through the presentation several times before I give it on air. How do I settle nerves and stage fright? It actually happens it happens worse for me giving these kind of podcasts and interviews stage fright and nerves, because I don't hear you and I don't see you, and it makes me extremely nervous. And when I get into a really nervous situation like that, I'll stand up, and that does help me relax a little bit, because then I can kind of start using my hands and moving around. Even though I'm tethered by a headphone set, I can still move around a little bit, and that does help me relax a little bit. Beth says she talks in the rearview mirror. Yes, it does. It does help. Everything you can do, it does help. I applaud you. I don't practice in front of a mirror myself. I do practice in front of my computer. Yeah, I used to practice in front of my cat, and the cat used to give me a big yawn and walk away. Like she was so bored she couldn't stand it. So I had to stop practicing in the house and going out in front of my computer. Breathing techniques. That's a really good question. I try to take pauses between long sentences. It doesn't always work. I do try to pace myself, because I have a hard time talking fast, and I trip up words really easily. So I try to, get a breath in, and I do talk a little bit slower than I normally talk when I'm giving a presentation. And I think that does help me breathe. But the experts do say, take what is it? Breathe from the diaphragm and, project out. That's a good question. What do you do if you really don't particularly like your guest, or if you're on the other end and you really don't particularly care for the person you're being interviewed by or interviewing? Gosh, you really do have to kind of think of them in a more detached way. Figure out how you can detach yourself from your feelings while you're interviewing them, and that is really hard because we are so, we are human beings. So, I think I would probably try to think of them as somebody else while the interview happened. Do my best to pretend like they were somebody from a different planet or something like that. Of course, they always recommend that you think of yourself in a more powerful position. They say think of people with their clothes off, so that you feel either funny or giggly or more powerful than them. Yeah, just think of them like they're on a different planet. Absolutely. Can you cut an interview short? Absolutely. There is nothing that we are doing and what we're talking about here that means that we have to continue on through an interview, either as a guest or as an interviewer. Yes, if your reputation either way is being damaged or harmed by the interview, don't be afraid to cut it off and walk away. Again, we're probably not going to end up on 60 Minutes or, Frontline or Nightline or whatever it's called. Do cut it short. You don't have to put up with that stuff. You have boundaries. Okay, so I want to kind of wrap this up, let you all go, because I do know this is a busy week for everybody. So next week we're going to talk about podcasting software and hardware. Danny's going to come on the line and give us a tour of some of the different podcast software and hardware that is available. And meanwhile, if you have any questions about this, or you have any questions you'd like us to answer in the next several weeks during this series, please come on to the Web Seller Circle and join us on the forum and ask those questions. And Danny and I both want to thank you for your support of the Web Seller Circle. We really appreciate it. We couldn't have done it without you. So we want to thank you and invite you to continue participating on the forum and come back next week.